36 hours after my wife became paralyzed, my mother demanded that I divorce her. She came with a lawyer, threats, and a plan to end my wife's life. When did I first understand that the person who gave me life had stopped being human to me? It wasn't a slow dawning. It detonated, precise and cruel, 36 hours after the head-on that left James paralyzed from the neck down. I remember the antiseptic smell of the intensive ward at Mercy General, bleach that couldn't cleanse the way my world had ruptured. And then my mother, whom I will no longer call by the name she was born with. From now on, she is John because nothing maternal remained in what she said or did. She pushed through the sliding doors like she owned the place and, without greeting, began recruiting me for a crime: to abandon my wife. "I'm only trying to protect you," John said, the words sharpened into an accusation. She started rattling off questions in that practiced clinical tone only a retired nurse can weaponize. Had I thought about medical debt? About the probability of recovery? As a physical therapist, I could list every reason James would recover. John, who still treated me like a child, called each of my hopes delusional. James's eyes were glassy, tracking my voice as if she feared it might drift away. I pointed it out. John's face folded into something like pity and then cruelty. "That's just reflex," she said, as if dissection of a person were merely observation. "Everybody with a working brain knows she's gone." The words landed like stones. James, so fragile, so present, let out a sob. Seeing her cry ignited something hot and animal inside me. I shoved John out of the room with hands that shook. She came back before nightfall. This time she brought backup: her old supervisor from the ward and a divorce attorney with a tidy smile. They sat at James's bedside like vultures negotiating terms. I was there moving James's limp arms, forcing blood into tissue that screamed in protest. Her pulse climbed. Her breaths came thin and rapid. John spoke over me, loud enough for the monitors to flinch, delivering the verdict with practiced detachment. "The kindest thing you can do is free your husband from this burden," she told James, as if she were proposing a vacation. "He probably doesn't want it anyway." My jaw locked. Anger flared, but anger would spike James's heart, so I did what I could. I called a nurse. The nurse, sympathetic in a way that made me wish workplaces came with conscience filters, escorted them out. I marched to administration and laid out the harassment, expecting outrage. Instead, I got a shrug wrapped in respectability. John was an experienced nurse who had once worked in this very hospital. Given everything, maybe she was right. A loving mother worried for her son. They allowed her back. That night, I sat in the stiff plastic chair, knuckles white around my wife's fingers, and recited the vows like a talisman. I ran through our best memories: the stupid first coffee date, the honeymoon where we invented stupid inside jokes. Anything to anchor us both. When I felt it, it was as if the world exhaled with me. James's finger twitched. The twitch was a comet. I bolted from the room screaming with a happiness so fierce it hurt. I came back and cradled her like she might shatter, whispering promises I wasn't sure I believed yet. Before dawn, she returned. John arrived at 5 a.m., this time with spreadsheets and a man who looked like he balanced other people's humanity the way he balanced numbers. "You'll drain your savings," she said, tapping columns as if James were an expense entry. "That woman is gone. In 5 years, you'll be homeless." She held up 2 fingers like a judge issuing terms. 48 hours, she said. "Agree to the divorce or I'll petition for guardianship." Then she leaned close and whispered the thing that split me in two. "If I'm her guardian, I'll just pull the plug. No divorce needed." Her voice was calm enough to be obscene. I clenched my fist so hard I could hear my bones creak. I was seconds from making her regret the breath she'd taken. Instead, I sat on trembling hands and tried to be the steady shore for my wife. My head spun with legal statutes and hospital policy and the ugly arithmetic of a future they were writing for me. James's breathing hitched. I prayed silently for a miracle. And then came the miracle I didn't know we still had. A pressure on my palm so deliberate it could not be random. 1 long press, a pause, 4 quick presses, another pause, 3 more. The code we'd made on our honeymoon, the childish number alphabet that used to make us laugh in airports, spelled itself against my skin. I love you. It was small, luminous, defiant. Hope, betrayal, love, and rage braided into a single heartbeat, and I knew in that moment nothing John could ever do would make me abandon her. My heart nearly burst. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, as if it might tear itself open just to let the feeling escape. Tears came hot and unbidden, blurring James's face until it became a smear of light and shadow. Nothing, not the monitors, not the ticking clock, not even John's threats, existed in that instant except James's thumb pressing back into my palm. I covered her face and hands in kisses, frantic and reverent. It was 3 in the morning, but I felt sharper, more awake, than I had in months. The hospital's fluorescent lights seemed less harsh, the air itself charged. Sleep was out of the question. I dialed my lawyer with shaking fingers, breathless as I told him. James was still here. She was fighting. And for the first time, I had proof. By dawn, the hope had crystallized into something fierce. James and I began our routine, gentle passive movements to keep her muscles from atrophy. But this time, it was different. As I guided her thumb toward her palm, she resisted. Not a spasm, not tension. Deliberate resistance. Controlled movement. My throat closed around a sob. She pushed back again, harder. My darling James knew. She understood what we were up against, and this tiny rebellion was her battle cry. We could prove voluntary control now. We could finally silence them. For the first time in days, everything seemed to align. Then the door opened. John again trailing her perfume of antiseptic and power games. She must have heard about James's progress because she arrived with her next weapon. A neurologist friend, his tie knotted with clinical detachment. He barely touched James's hand, spent 5 cursory minutes with her before pronouncing his verdict. This is reflexive, involuntary. Your wife is gone, son. His words were a guillotine. Something inside me snapped. My voice cracked like a whip. You're insane, I roared at both of them, my pulse thudding in my temples. I turned to John, my own mother by blood but nothing more, and spat the question that had been growing like a tumor. What is wrong with you? What kind of mother does this to her own son? John didn't even blink. She turned to the neurologist instead. He'd already drawn his prescription pad. With a few swipes of his pen, my reality shifted. The husband is exhibiting signs of psychosis, he murmured, like reading a weather report. We recommend psychiatric evaluation and immediate removal from his wife's medical decisions. He signed, handed the slip to John. She thanked him, then faced me with her predator's calm. You have 24 hours left to decide, she said. When the door clicked shut behind them, the room felt both cavernous and suffocating. I dragged my chair so close to James's bed the rail pressed into my ribs. My hand found hers, warm, steady, human. The clock read 11:47 p.m., but I already knew I wouldn't sleep. Couldn't. John's threats played on a loop in my skull like a broken record. I forced myself to focus instead on James's breathing, the monitor's steady beep, and the faint, deliberate pressure of her thumb. A code only we understood. Around 2 a.m., it came again. 1 press, pause, 4 quick presses, pause, 3 more. I love you. My throat closed. I squeezed back and whispered our war cry. I love you. We're going to fight this. Together. At 6:03 a.m., my phone vibrated. I snatched it before the second ring. My lawyer's voice was tired but clear. I spilled everything, every detail, while James's thumb kept pressing against mine like a heartbeat. He told me to document everything, every movement, every witness, every insult, and he'd start working on legal options immediately. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at James's hand still warm in mine. That's when I realized I needed more than memory. I needed evidence no one could twist. I dug a notebook from my bag, opened to the first blank page, wrote the date and time at the top. Then I began. Each thumb press, each twitch, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, timestamps down to the minute. At 6:30 a.m., the night nurse came in to check vitals. I showed her my notes, pages already filling with proof of James's will. She looked, nodded slowly, then did something I didn't expect. She pulled up James's chart on the computer and began typing, adding her own observations of the coded thumb presses. She didn't say much, just gave me a small, knowing nod before leaving. For the first time, someone inside the system believed me. At 6:58 a.m., voices in the hallway made my stomach clench. John. Her silhouette moved past the frosted glass like a storm cloud. I grabbed my phone, opened the voice recorder, hit record, and placed it face down on the bedside table. With my other hand, I pulled up the patient advocate's number I'd saved. Ready. At exactly 7 a.m., the door swung open. John strode in with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as her financial advisor and began unfurling spreadsheets across the foot of James's bed, as though this was a boardroom. John launched into a speech she'd clearly rehearsed. Medical bankruptcy, lifetime care costs, how I'd lose the house in 2 years. Her words were daggers hidden in concern. And as she spoke, James's thumb pressed into my palm again and again, our silent code beating louder than John's voice. The financial advisor spread his spreadsheets like a battlefield map, his finger darting across columns of compound interest, asset liquidation, and medical debt forecasts as though James were a portfolio instead of a person. John stood beside him like a general, nodding along to each bleak projection. For 3 endless minutes, I let them talk, my phone quietly capturing every syllable. My hand trembled, not with fear but with a cold, steady rage. Then I lifted the phone so they could see the red recording light. "Everything you're saying is being documented," I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut. "And I've got the patient advocate on speed dial. Leave, now." John's face flushed crimson, her lips compressed into a thin, bloodless line. The advisor's eyes flicked to her and then to my phone. He swept his papers into his briefcase without a word, and together they slunk out, their silence heavier than their threats. I saved the recording, stamped it with the time, and added it to my growing log. By 7:45 a.m., I was striding down to hospital administration with my notebook under my arm like a legal brief. The same woman who'd dismissed me yesterday sat at her desk. This time her posture stiffened as she saw me approach. I dropped into the chair across from her, opened the notebook, and laid my evidence between us. Timestamps, witness names, nurses' notes, John's whispered threats to pull the plug if she gained guardianship. The administrator shuffled papers and avoided my eyes, murmuring about John's long history at this hospital, her experience as a retired nurse. She suggested maybe my judgment was clouded by stress. I swallowed my anger, met her gaze, and said evenly, "I'm a licensed physical therapist. I know what I'm documenting. This is harassment and undue influence over my wife's care." She cleared her throat, said she'd make a note of my concerns, but claimed she couldn't restrict family visits without proper cause. My fingers tightened around the notebook. "Then tell me the proper procedure," I said. "Patient advocate, formal restrictions, everything." Reluctantly, she produced a stack of forms. I filled them out right there at her desk, handwriting steady, listing James's elevated heart rates during John's visits, her tears, her distress, the documented pattern of harassment. I attached names of staff who'd witnessed it, timestamps of every encounter. When I handed the papers back, I asked for copies. She stamped each one with date and time, her rubber stamp a hollow echo of accountability. Back in James's room at 9:15 a.m., I set up a small tripod borrowed from the nurse's station. The phone's lens framed James's face and hands. "We're making a record," I told her softly. "Squeeze once for yes, twice for no." I asked if she could hear me. One firm squeeze. Did she want John to keep visiting? 2 quick squeezes. Did she want to stay married to me? 1 strong squeeze that nearly broke me. Then I asked her to spell something in our honeymoon code. Her thumb pressed out the numbers, deliberate and slow. Stay. Fight. Love. The day nurse entered midway, stood silently by the door. I could see her glancing between the screen and James's hand, her fingers moving on her tablet. When I ended the recording, she walked over without a word and added her own observations to James's official chart. For the first time, I felt like my notebook wasn't just a private act of desperation, but a weapon that could defend us. At 11:30 a.m., the door swung open again. John, and this time she brought Robert. I stayed in my chair beside James, phone recording discreetly in my pocket. Robert barely glanced at James before declaring he needed to perform a neurological assessment. His exam lasted no more than 4 minutes. A few cursory touches to her hand, a quick glance at her fingers. Then he straightened, pronouncing judgment like a priest of science. "These are purely reflexive spinal responses," he said. "No voluntary motor control. You're seeing patterns that aren't there?" I tried to show him the logs, the videos, the nurse's notes. He talked over me, his voice a steady drizzle meant to drown mine out. John stood behind him, arms folded, eyes glittering. I could feel the trap tightening around us again. I argued until my throat felt raw. I told Robert she wasn't just twitching, she was answering me. She was spelling words, using a code only we knew. I described the yes-no responses, the deliberate resistance, the thumb presses that spelled out stay, fight, love. But Robert didn't even look at me. He just shook his head, the kind of slow, pitying shake reserved for the delusional. John leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed, a faint, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth, like someone watching a chess opponent walk straight into checkmate. Robert tore a page from his prescription pad without even sitting down. "Denial-based psychosis," he wrote as he spoke. "Inability to accept medical reality. Recommend psychiatric evaluation. Remove from medical decision-making." He scribbled in quick strokes, then handed the paper to John. She accepted it with both hands as if it were a coronation document instead of a weapon. Her eyes flicked up to mine. "Less than 24 hours now," she said. Her tone wasn't even cruel, it was bored, as if she'd already won. They walked out together. I could hear their voices in the hallway, low and conspiratorial. Words like guardianship and psychiatric hold filtering back through the door. My pulse thundered in my ears. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the monitor's green blips, fighting the urge to throw the chair across the room. Then my fingers moved on their own, dialing my lawyer. I explained Robert's recommendation, the psych eval label, my voice shaking with fury. He was calm but firm. "Request a patient advocate formally in writing," he said. "Notify risk management. Document every attempt to remove you from decision-making. Draft the letters now and send them with read receipts." I opened my email on my phone with hands that still trembled. Right there in James's room, I wrote to hospital administration requesting an immediate patient advocate assignment. I cited harassment, threats to my decision-making authority, attached the documentation log, the morning's recording, copies of nurses' notes confirming James's voluntary responses. I sent it with a read receipt and stared at the screen until the confirmation came through. Then I drafted the second letter to risk management. This one was a scalpel. I laid out John's harassment from the very first day, 36 hours after the crash, her threats to pull the plug if she gained guardianship, Robert's 5-minute exam that contradicted multiple nursing observations documented in James's official chart. I listed every date, every time, every witness by name. I attached my entire log showing James's consistent voluntary responses over multiple days. I even attached the video of her responding correctly to commands, spelling out our secret code. I sent that email with a read receipt too. Then I backed up everything to 3 different places. Only when all the digital confirmations came through did my hands stop shaking. I slid my chair back to James's bedside and took her hand gently, as though we were fragile glass in a world of hammers. Her thumb pressed once against my palm. Our silent heartbeat. We were still in this fight together, no matter what John unleashed next. At 8 p.m., my phone rang. My lawyer's voice was different this time. Heavier, more deliberate. He told me he was referring me to someone who specialized in cases like ours, a disability rights attorney named David McCarthy. He'd handled patient autonomy disputes, family coercion cases, and won. The name felt like a lifeline. I grabbed a pen and wrote the number on the back of my documentation notebook, pressing the ink hard enough to dent the page. My lawyer explained David's track record, victories against family members who'd tried to override spousal decision-making rights. I thanked him and dialed immediately, not caring that the sky outside had gone black. A man answered on the second ring, his voice low, alert. Words tumbled out of me in a rush, a chaotic flood. The accident, James's paralysis, John's intrusion, the divorce attorney, the financial advisor, the ultimatum, the so-called psychosis. Slow down, David said gently. Start from the beginning. So I did. I told him about the crash, about James's eyes following my voice when John called it a reflex, about the thumb presses spelling our honeymoon code, about the resistance in her hand during therapy. Each memory came out like a wound reopening, but David listened, his occasional questions precise, targeted. For the first time, I felt like someone was mapping the nightmare with me instead of trying to write me out of it. David's questions cut straight through the fog, one after another. What documentation do you have? He asked. I opened my notebook and read it out like a litany. Timestamps, witness names, nursing notes, recordings, video clips, everything. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. What exact threats has she made? He pressed. I repeated John's words, every vile syllable about pulling the plug if she got guardianship. There was a silence on the line, heavy as lead. Then David asked the one question I dreaded. Do you have that threat recorded or witnessed? I closed my eyes. No, I said quietly. She whispered it. But everything else, every reaction, every spike in James's vitals, is documented. The nurse's notes, too. He shifted gears immediately. And the neurologist? The psych evaluation recommendation? I explained Robert's 5-minute exam, his prescription pad diagnosis, the words denial-based psychosis scribbled like a curse. David exhaled. All right, keep documenting everything. Don't sign a single paper John gives you. If she tries to file for guardianship, call me immediately. I'll handle it. We talked for nearly an hour. By the time I hung up, my hands still shook, but the room felt different. For the first time, someone understood how serious this was. Someone who knew the battlefield. I slid back into the chair at James's bedside, took her hand and whispered, We've got help now. A real attorney. Someone who's fought cases like ours. Her thumb pressed once against my palm. I squeezed back, my throat closing around a sob. The night stretched thin and cold. I stayed awake watching her breathe, adjusting her pillows after each vital check. The monitors beeped their steady lullaby. Around 2 a.m., exhaustion had almost swallowed me when her thumb moved again. 1 press. Pause. 4 quick presses. Pause. 3 presses. I love you. My eyes snapped open. She did it again, deliberate and steady. The same pattern, 1 to 4, 3. I love you. Then she changed it. 4 presses. Pause. 3 presses. Pause. 1 press. Stay. Then again. 1, 4, 3, love. Then another new one. 5 presses. Pause. 3 presses. Pause. 4 presses. Pause. 2 presses. Fight. My tears blurred the world. I grabbed my notebook and scribbled furiously, hands shaking, writing each pattern and the exact wall clock time. I hit the call button for the nurse. She came in and found me crying, my notebook open like evidence on a courtroom table. She's doing it, I choked out. She's spelling messages. Please, watch. The nurse nodded once and stood by the bed. I held James's hand. Do it again, sweetheart. James pressed the patterns again, slower but clear. The nurse's eyebrows rose. She began typing on her tablet as she watched, documenting in real time. I'm adding this to her official chart, she said softly. Witnessed voluntary communication. This is significant progress. After she left, I stayed holding James's hand, whispering how proud I was, how strong she was, how we were going to beat this together. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there in the dark, feeling her thumb press against mine like a pulse of defiance. When the morning nurse came in at 7 a.m. for shift change, I showed her my overnight log, every timestamp, every pattern. She read it carefully, then pulled up James's chart. The night nurse's notes were already there. Do you mind if I add my own observation? She asked. Please, I said. She typed for several minutes, then turned the screen so I could read. Patient demonstrates consistent, voluntary, purposeful movement in response to spouse's verbal cues. distinct from reflexive responses. Pattern recognition and communication via established code system indicates preserved cognitive function and intentional motor control. "Can I get a printed copy?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. The printer hummed and the paper came out warm. She handed it to me. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my documentation folder. It felt like the first official crack in John's story. Finally, real medical backing for what I'd been trying to prove. At exactly noon, my phone rang. David. His voice had a different edge now. No longer exploratory, but strategic. "I've been thinking about your case all night," he said. "I have a plan. First, we send a cease and desist letter to John, formally demanding she stop the harassment and threats." For the first time in days, I exhaled. We weren't just documenting anymore, we were about to fight back. David's plan came like a blueprint for war. "First," he said, "we send the cease and desist to John today. Second, we file a formal visitor policy restriction request with the hospital, citing the documented pattern of patient distress. Third, I'll request an ethics committee review of the coercion patterns to get institutional backing. Fourth, we prepare for an emergency hearing in case she files for guardianship." His voice was steady, each point a nail in the coffin of John's scheme. "Are you ready to retain me officially?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "Check your email," he told me. "The agreement's already there. Read it, sign it, and we'll be officially attorney-client." I opened my phone. The agreement had arrived seconds before. I skimmed it. Fee structure reasonable, payment plan built in, clear outlines of confidentiality. My finger trembled only slightly as I signed across the screen and hit send. 5 minutes later, David confirmed receipt. "We're official," he said. "Everything you tell me now is privileged. I'll start drafting the cease and desist immediately. It'll be ready by end of business today." I hung up and exhaled for what felt like the first time all week. At 3 p.m., there was a soft knock on James's door. A woman entered, mid-50s, hair pinned neatly, kind eyes framed by fine lines of experience. She introduced herself as Mary McCarthy, the patient advocate assigned to our case. Her voice had a calm authority that immediately steadied my nerves. She pulled up a chair, sat down across from me, and spent an hour asking questions. Not perfunctory checkboxes. Real questions. About the accident, about John's visits, about the pattern of harassment. She flipped through my documentation like a detective, reading the timeline, the nursing notes, even watching the video recordings I'd made. Finally, she stood and turned to James, her tone soft but direct. "James, my name is Mary. I'm here to help you. If you can hear and understand me, squeeze once for yes." James's thumb moved firmly against the bed. Mary's eyes flicked to me, then back to James. She asked more yes-no questions, clear, simple. And James answered each correctly. Mary jotted everything down, her pen scratching quick notes. Then she turned to me. "I've helped establish trauma-informed visitation policies," she said. "We'll monitor James's stress levels during all family visits. Any visitor causing documented distress can be restricted." It felt like a tide receding, the first moment of real relief. Someone with actual authority was finally taking this seriously. Before leaving, Mary said she would recommend an ethics committee consultation. They would review all documentation, interview relevant staff, and possibly speak with John herself. If the pattern is clear, she explained, their recommendation will be binding on hospital policy and can be used in court if necessary. I thanked her again and again. She squeezed my shoulder before she left, saying softly, "You're doing everything right. Keep advocating for her. You're her anchor." That night, I turned our room into a war room. I printed out every page of my logs, placing them in chronological order inside a 3-ring binder with labeled tabs. I transferred every video file to a thumb drive with precise file names and timestamps. I made copies of every nursing note mentioning James's responses or John's visits. I collected written statements from the nurses who had witnessed James's communication. I built a detailed timeline of John's escalating threats, from the first demand for divorce to the whispered "pull the plug" to the psych evaluation smear. When I sent everything to David, he called back an hour later. "This is exactly what we need," he said. You've built a case file that's going to be very hard to dispute. For the first time, it felt like we had not just hope, but leverage. The next morning, while I was doing passive range of motion exercises with James's arms, a sharp knock came at the door. A man in a suit stepped in, carrying a manila envelope. His expression was neutral, practiced. "Are you James's husband?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my stomach sinking even before he spoke again. He held out the envelope. "You've been served." The words hit like a gunshot. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, and when I tore it open, my stomach dropped. Petition for emergency guardianship. John's name glared from the top of the page like a brand. I skimmed through the dense legal text, bile rising with every sentence. Respondent is mentally unfit to make medical decisions. Patient is in a persistent vegetative state with no hope of recovery. Spouse is delusional and refusing to accept medical reality. Each line was another knife. She'd described James as brain dead. She'd painted me as a madman. And at the bottom, transfer all medical decision-making authority to John as guardian, with the power to make end-of-life decisions. I sat down hard in the chair by James's bed, the papers rattling in my hands, my pulse hammering in my temples. I dialed David immediately, voice breaking as I explained. He told me to photograph every single page. My fingers were so unsteady I had to hold the phone with both hands, forcing it to focus long enough to snap the pictures. 10 minutes later, David called back. "Don't panic," he said, his voice low and steady, a lifeline cutting through the chaos. "We have strong grounds for objection. I'm filing it today. I'll request a temporary restraining order against her harassment and attach your entire dossier. Documentation, nursing notes, videos. We'll also push for an expedited hearing given the emergency filing. Expect a court date within 1 to 2 weeks. Until then, keep documenting everything, especially James's progress." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That afternoon, a social worker arrived, clipboard in hand, professional but not unkind. "Part of the standard protocol," she explained. "A safety and stress assessment triggered by the guardianship petition." Her questions were careful, clinical. My mental state, my support system, my long-term care plan for James. I told her the truth, the fear, the exhaustion, but also my training as a physical therapist, the structure of my documentation, the evidence of James's responses. I showed her the logs, the videos, the nurse's notes. She stood beside James's bed as I held her hand and asked her to respond. James pressed her thumb with perfect clarity. The social worker wrote quickly, nodding as she observed. When she left, she said, "I'll submit my report to the court. From what I've seen, you appear to be a competent, caring spouse acting in your wife's best interests." Her words were a salve I desperately needed. Later, Mary returned, her expression focused but encouraging. She pulled up a chair and said, "I've been working on something for you. I contacted William Espinosa, a neuro-rehab specialist who works with spinal cord and traumatic brain injuries. He's willing to do a full evaluation of James's cognitive function and voluntary movement." My heart lurched. Finally, someone who could prove what I'd been documenting. "The appointment is set for 2 days from now," she continued, "pending insurance authorization. I've already submitted the request and flagged it as urgent, given the guardianship petition. If James's responses are voluntary, he'll demonstrate it with standardized testing. That's the kind of evidence the court can't ignore." Relief washed over me so forcefully I almost laughed. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you." Mary smiled faintly. "This is my job," she said simply. That evening, while James slept, I sat in the corner answering work emails. My boss called. I'd sent him a request for emergency family leave earlier, and he confirmed it was approved without hesitation. But then his tone shifted. "Just a heads up," he said. "Our short-term disability only covers 60% of your salary after the first 2 weeks." I thanked him. I was grateful. But the numbers instantly started spinning in my head. Savings accounts, medical costs, time, the math of survival, and beneath it all, the envelope still sat on the bedside table. A reminder that John was no longer just meddling. She was coming for control, and she wanted James's life in her hands. We had maybe 3 months of expenses saved if I was careful, 4 at the most if I cut everything to the bone. After that, I had no idea how we'd survive. I shoved the numbers out of my mind and clung to the single comfort I had left. At least I could stay by James's side full time, without worrying that my job would vanish out from under me. The next morning, I ducked into the cafeteria for coffee, the kind that tasted like burned plastic but kept me upright. My phone buzzed. My brother. His voice was hesitant, tinged with unease. "What's going on with James? Mom's saying you've lost your mind." The words made my stomach lurch. Of course. John was working the phone, spinning her web, calling everyone in our family, and James's, painting me as unstable, claiming I was torturing James by refusing to give her dignified end-of-life care. I sat at a sticky cafeteria table for nearly an hour, explaining everything. James's voluntary thumb presses, the code we'd built on our honeymoon, her eyes following my voice. John's threats, her ultimatum, the guardianship petition. My brother didn't interrupt much, just listened, quiet and heavy. When I finally stopped, he let out a slow breath. "I believe you," he said. "John's always been controlling. I'm not surprised she's pulling this. I'll call the others. I'll set the record straight." By the time I hung up, exhaustion weighed me down like lead. But at least for once, I wasn't standing alone. That afternoon in James's room, I decided it was time to push further. The speech therapist had left a laminated communication board on the rolling table. Simple, just the alphabet in neat rows. I positioned James's thumb over the letters, explained the system. I'd guide her hand, she'd press when we reached the right one. We started with basics. Yes, no questions. "Do you want to stay with me?" Her thumb pressed hard on the Y. "Do you want John to have guardianship?" Silence. Not a twitch. A perfect, deliberate no. Then we moved to words. It took 20 long minutes, but letter by letter she spelled YES when I asked if she loved me. The occupational therapist had been standing quietly in the doorway. When James finished, she came closer, eyes shining, and added her own official notes to the chart. 2 more sessions followed that afternoon. James spelled STAY and then LOV. My heart broke and healed at the same time. I documented every letter, every timestamp, every witness signature. That evening, my inbox pinged. A message from Barbara Carson, chair of the hospital's ethics committee. She was scheduling a multi-party meeting for the next afternoon. The email was strict. Ground rules enforced, civility mandatory, evidence reviewed objectively. Provisional boundaries would be set while the full review unfolded. I read it 3 times, each line pressing a little more oxygen back into my lungs. Then I forwarded it to David. He called within 10 minutes. "This is exactly what we wanted," he said. "The ethics committee has teeth. They can restrict John's access, protect James, and their recommendations will carry weight in court. Bring everything, logs, videos, notes, and stay calm, no matter what she says." Later that night, I stretched out on the fold-out chair in James's room, sleep just beginning to pull at my eyelids when my phone buzzed. A new email. Subject line, updated financial projections. It was from John's financial advisor. Attached were 3 spreadsheets, grim graphs and numbers stretching 5 years into the future, showing how keeping James at home would bankrupt us by year 3, forcing foreclosure on the house. The timing was obvious. It was meant to rattle me before the ethics meeting, to corner me with fear. For a moment, I felt the old anxiety rise, that gnawing panic in my chest. But then a strange calm followed. Because now, this wasn't just harassment. This was evidence. Another piece of her campaign of coercion, neatly gift-wrapped and time-stamped in my inbox. I saved the email, attached it to my dossier, and sat there in the dim hospital light, holding James's hand, feeling her thumb press faintly against mine. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were preparing for battle. I forwarded the spreadsheet email to David with a note about the timing. His reply came back within minutes. Perfect. More evidence of harassment. Adding it to the file. The next morning, David called again. His voice was steady but carried the urgency of a ticking clock. "We've got a court date," he said. "Temporary hearing, 1 week out. That gives us a narrow window for discovery and witness prep." My stomach tightened. 1 week. We'll need written statements from every nurse who witnessed James's voluntary responses, David continued, and from anyone who observed her distress during John's visits. Keep documenting progress, photos, videos, logs, everything. Remember, John's attorney is going to argue you're an unfit decision maker, in denial about medical reality. They'll try to paint you as unstable. I swallowed hard. What else? Expect subpoenas, he warned. Your medical records, your work history, they'll dig for anything to discredit you. The war was escalating. The next morning at 9 sharp, William Espinoza arrived. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, glasses perched low on his nose, leather bag of instruments swinging at his side. He greeted me briefly, then turned to James. And unlike Robert, unlike every skeptic who had dismissed her, William spoke directly to her. "James, I'm here to evaluate your responses," he explained gently. "We'll take our time." For 2 full hours he worked with her. Simple commands: squeeze, release. Eye tracking: follow the pen light left, then right. Yes, no squeezes, single and double. He layered in complexity, asking her to follow 2-step commands, measuring her response times with a stopwatch, recording every detail in his spiral notebook. He never rushed her, never treated her as absent. And James responded. Not perfectly, not instantly, but deliberately. Each squeeze, each shift of her eyes, each pause before she obeyed. Proof that she was still here. When he finished, he closed the notebook and looked at me. "I'll write a full evaluation within 48 hours, he said. "But preliminarily, she has cognitive processing ability, and she has voluntary motor control." The words landed like oxygen in starving lungs. That afternoon, I went straight to the hospital's medical staff office and filed a formal complaint against Robert. I detailed everything: his 5-minute exam, his failure to perform a single standardized cognitive test, his recommendation that I be evaluated for psychosis without ever assessing me. I attached my documentation log, complete with timestamps, showing James's voluntary responses. The same responses Robert had dismissed as reflex. The administrator accepted my complaint, promising it would be reviewed by the peer review committee. Later, Mary stopped by and said she'd added her own observations. She'd witnessed Robert's boundary violations, his condescension, his disregard for the nurse's notes. "It may take a few weeks," she warned, "but it's important this is on record." I nodded. One more stone on John's crumbling tower. That evening, while I guided James's arms through slow range of motion exercises, my phone buzzed. The insurance case manager. Her tone was matter-of-fact, almost detached. "James has been flagged for transfer to long-term acute care," she said. "Not acute rehab. Based on her current condition, recovery potential is limited." The words hit like a blade. Long-term acute care was a warehouse for people written off as hopeless. A place where progress wasn't expected or supported. Panic surged in my chest. She's showing voluntary movement. She's communicating. I have documentation. The case manager cut in. "Those observations aren't in the official record yet. You have 72 hours to file an appeal with supporting evidence." When the call ended, I stood there in James's room, phone clenched in my fist, heart hammering. 72 hours to prove she deserved a chance at real recovery. I turned to my desk, already pulling papers together. William's preliminary findings, the nurse's notes, my professional assessment as a physical therapist. The videos. Every shred of proof that James was not a body to discard, but a woman still fighting, still here. I stacked it all in a growing pile, each page and file not just evidence, but a promise. John would not write James's ending. I stayed up the entire night building the appeal packet, combing through every scrap of documentation and arranging it like ammunition. At the front, I wrote a cover letter explaining why James needed acute rehab, not long-term care. Why she deserved a chance at recovery instead of being warehoused to wait for decline. By morning, my eyes were raw from lack of sleep, but I had something solid in my hands. That was when Mary appeared at James's door with a clipboard tucked under her arm and 2 familiar nurses in tow, both from the night shift, both faces James had already seen before. "We're implementing trauma-informed care," she said. Her tone left no room for debate. She explained the changes with crisp precision. A rotating team of consistent nurses, so James would always recognize who was in the room. Visitor traffic limited to immediate family with mandatory check-ins at the nurses' station. A log system to track James's vitals before and after each visit. If someone consistently causes distress, Mary said, her eyes locking on mine, they lose visiting privileges. Immediately. I didn't need her to say the name. I knew exactly who she meant. One of the nurses rolled in a small speaker and asked if James liked music. Classical, I said, without hesitation. 10 minutes later, soft piano melodies wrapped around the room like a balm. Mary scheduled quiet hours twice a day. Absolute silence unless a medical emergency occurred. Her brain needs calm, she explained. Healing requires rest, not constant agitation. For the first time in days, I felt something in my chest unclench. Someone with real authority was treating James like a person, not a lost cause. That afternoon, William returned, this time with a medical student shadowing him. He carried a stack of assessment forms, and after greeting us, he pulled a chair right up to James's bedside. He explained his plan to her as though she could answer aloud. Odd numbers, squeeze. Even numbers, no squeeze. We'll test your ability to process and control. I stepped back against the wall, hands pressed to my sides as if holding myself together. William began. 3. James squeezed. 6. Nothing. 9. A squeeze. 4. Nothing. 8 trials in all? She got 7 correct. The only miss was number 11, and I could see the effort trembling through her hand before exhaustion overtook it. William's notes were meticulous: grip strength, response time, accuracy. To the student, he said firmly, "This is cognitive processing, voluntary motor control. Reflexes don't follow randomized verbal commands. Reflexes don't demonstrate pattern recognition." The student hesitated. Could she be responding to tone of voice? William shook his head. No, randomization plus accuracy. She's understanding, she's choosing. When he left, he promised a full written evaluation within 24 hours. The next morning, I met a notary in the hospital lobby with a thick folder David had overnighted. She was an older woman, calm, practiced, unshaken by the tension humming through me. At a small cafe table, she reviewed every page before I signed. Documents reaffirming my status as James's spouse and decision-maker, our advance directives written in James's own hand 2 years earlier when we bought life insurance. In her clear script, James had written that she wanted all reasonable rehabilitation efforts if she were ever seriously injured. The notary stamped and signed each page, the sound of her seal hitting paper like the clang of armor. She told me these documents would stand in any courtroom. No one can override her stated wishes without extraordinary evidence, she said. I thanked her, scanned everything into my phone, and sent it straight to David. His reply came back fast, perfect. Adding this to our filing, exactly the kind of evidence we needed. 2 days later, the ethics committee convened. The conference room was windowless, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air tight and stale. Barbara Carson sat at the head of the long table, 4 other members spread evenly down each side. Mary sat beside me, calm but ready. I felt my pulse racing in my throat. Across from me sat John, arms crossed, face a mask of blank stone. The war we'd been fighting in hospital rooms and whispered hallways was finally out in the open. Barbara opened the meeting with a clipped, professional tone. This committee has reviewed multiple written complaints about family conflict interfering with patient care. We're here to assess visitor impact on patient welfare. Nothing more, nothing less. Her eyes moved to me. Please begin. I opened the binder, the weight of it grounding me, and walked them step by step through the nightmare. The timeline of John's visits, James's physical responses, each entry time-stamped. Nursing observations charted in black and white. I showed them the visitor log Mary had implemented, hard numbers that didn't lie. James's heart rate spiking 20 points every time John entered the room. Mary added her own notes. Calm, clinical. She explained the harassment pattern, the way James's vitals destabilized during John's presence, the visible tears and agitation. Then the nurses spoke, one after another. The first described James crying during John's divorce would be best speech. The second recounted walking in to find me physically blocking John from James's bedside. The third read directly from her chart. Exact times, exact vitals. The moment John's words pushed James's heart rate into dangerous territory. Through it all, John sat stone still. Not a twitch of remorse, not a flicker of shame. Just arms crossed, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond us. When Barbara finally asked if she wished to respond, John said flatly, "I'm concerned about my son's financial future and about James's quality of life." Barbara didn't even let her finish. "We're not here to debate care decisions. We are here to protect patient stability." She turned to the committee. "Effective immediately, provisional boundaries are in place. John must schedule visits 24 hours in advance. Maximum 30 minutes per visit. A staff member will be present at all times. Any violation will result in a complete visitation ban, pending full review." It felt like the first real verdict I'd won, but John tested it the very next morning. I was guiding James's arm through gentle stretches when raised voices filtered down the hall. I stepped into the doorway and saw her, locked in a standoff with the charge nurse. John's voice was sharp, insistent. "She's my daughter-in-law. I have a right to see her." The nurse was calm, steady. "You need to leave and reschedule. Those are the rules." Two uniformed security officers appeared in less than 2 minutes. They didn't raise their voices. They simply asked her to come with them. For the first time, John looked smaller, her power blunted by the presence of authority she couldn't bend. She walked toward the elevator without a glance in my direction. I stood frozen, watching until the doors closed. Relief surged. The system was finally working, but behind the relief was something jagged and raw. This was still my mother, and she had dragged us to this place. When I turned back, James's eyes were fixed on the doorway. "It's okay," I whispered. "She's gone." James's gaze slid to mine, and for a flicker of a second, I swore I saw relief shining there too. The next 2 days, David worked like a surgeon. He tracked down nurses who'd seen John at her worst and collected formal affidavits. The first came from the nurse present during the infamous visit with the divorce attorney. She included James's vital signs climbing into the danger zone, complete with monitor readings and timestamps. The second affidavit described John's financial advisor stunt with the spreadsheets, how she'd left me visibly shaking from stress. The third was from the night nurse who had stood in the room and watched James spell out, "I love you" in our honeymoon code. Her affidavit detailed the deliberate thumb presses, how they were categorically different from reflex spasms. Each affidavit stretched 3 pages, written in precise medical language stripped of personal opinion. No emotion, no family drama. Just clinical fact. David told me they were gold. "Exactly what we need," he said. "Neutral professionals, unimpeachable." And still, I wasn't finished. I returned to the medical staff office and filed another formal complaint. This one aimed directly at Robert. I detailed everything: his rushed 5-minute exam, his failure to administer a single cognitive test, his dismissal of James's voluntary movements, his reckless psychiatric note about me. I stapled copies of my documentation to the complaint, evidence that contradicted his every claim. The war wasn't just personal anymore. It was on paper, in affidavits, in official files. John's campaign was being dragged into the light, and the record was no longer hers to write. In my complaint against Robert, I laid it out plain. He'd recommended psychiatric evaluation for me without ever once assessing my mental state. I attached documentation logs showing James's consistent, purposeful responses, evidence he had brushed aside as reflex. I included William's preliminary evaluation, which directly contradicted Robert's conclusions. The administrator accepted my packet, said it would go to the peer review committee, and explained the process. A few weeks for review, Robert notified, asked to provide his account. That evening, Mary stopped by. She told me she'd added her own observations to the complaint file. She'd seen Robert's dismissive attitude, his refusal to even read the nursing documentation before writing his note about me. "The committee will see through it," she said. Meanwhile, I filed the insurance appeal online. Every shred of proof went into that packet. Williams' evaluation of James's cognitive function and motor control, nursing notes documenting her steady progress, my professional assessment as a licensed physical therapist explaining her rehabilitation potential. I even wrote a cover letter spelling out why James belonged in acute rehab, not long-term care. 47 pages in total. When I hit submit, I received an automatic confirmation email. An hour later, the case manager called. She'd received everything. The medical review team needs 5 to 7 business days to decide, she said. I asked what happened if they denied the appeal. You can request an expedited external review, she replied. I hung up feeling wrung out but also steady. I'd done everything I could. Then John's attorney sent his email. A settlement proposal. I opened it beside James's bed, reading line by line. The offer? Agree to an amicable divorce, and John would drop her guardianship petition. She'd even set up a trust for James's long-term care. It was grotesque. They were literally trying to buy me off, offering money to abandon my wife in exchange for avoiding a courtroom fight. I called David. I read him the entire proposal word for word. He was silent for a long moment, then asked, "Do you want me to send a formal rejection, or just ignore it?" "Reject it," I said. My voice didn't even tremble. "Put it in writing. Make it crystal clear. There will never be a divorce. Not now, not ever." "Consider it done," he said. That night, something shifted in James's room. The nursing staff began treating her communication not as novelty, but as fact. They asked yes-no questions and wrote her answers directly into the chart. "Do you want music?" one nurse asked. James squeezed once for yes. They cycled through stations until she squeezed twice for no at country music and once for yes when the piano came back on. "Do you want the blinds open?" James indicated she wanted them partially raised. "2 pillows or 1? She answered 2. Every preference was logged. Each note in her chart became evidence. James had preserved cognition. She had agency. She was still making decisions about her care and her comfort. The charge nurse pulled me aside. "This matters," she said. "This proves she's a decision maker, that she's not just lying there." For the first time, I felt like the staff truly saw her, not as a patient in a bed, but as James. My James. The next morning, Barbara called. She asked if I could meet her in a private conference room on the 3rd floor. I told James I'd be back in 30 minutes, kissed her forehead, and left. Barbara was already waiting, a folder in front of her, and a yellow notepad scribbled with cramped handwriting. She gestured for me to sit. "The ethics committee," she said, "looks for patterns. We examine whether family members are helping the patient or pushing their own agenda." Her words hung in the air. I braced myself, because if anyone understood John by now, it was me. And I knew her agenda was as cold as it was clear. Barbara leaned forward, her notepad between us, and began walking me through case after case the committee had handled. Families torn apart over treatment choices, siblings fighting over hospice versus rehab, children battling over whether to honor advanced directives. Her voice was calm, but each example carried weight. How they determined who was truly advocating for the patient and who was simply exerting control. I listened, then asked her the question that had been burning in my chest. "Do you think John's behavior counts as coercion?" She paused. Her pen hovered over the pad before she answered carefully. "I can't judge before the full committee reviews, but the threats, the harassment, the documented spikes in James's vitals?" She tapped her pen once. "It's concerning." Hearing her say it out loud, even measured, even cautious, was like someone finally naming the storm we'd been living in. She told me the committee would meet within a week to make formal recommendations about visitor policies and family involvement. She made sure to note every detail I'd provided. I thanked her, then went straight back upstairs, back to James. Sitting beside her bed, I felt for the first time like someone with authority truly understood. That afternoon, David called. His voice was sharp, energized. "I'm filing a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition." He explained that he'd spent the morning drafting arguments, that I was a competent spouse and a licensed healthcare professional, that James's documented responses proved cognitive function, and that John's petition was riddled with bias and outdated assumptions. The motion included everything: nursing affidavits, video evidence, the full timeline of John's threats. "I'll file it electronically within the hour," he said. "The court has to respond in a few days." Hope surged through me, fragile but fierce. Maybe, just maybe, this could end before a full hearing. But the reprieve lasted less than 24 hours. The next morning, an email from John's attorney arrived. I opened the attachment and felt the sickness pool in my gut as I read page after page of accusations. They claimed I was neglecting my work, that I was financially irresponsible. Somehow, they had my leave approval from my employer. They even had bank statements from the first week after the crash, itemizing every medical expense. The response painted me as a man drowning, an emotional, incompetent husband making reckless decisions, incapable of providing stability. John, they argued, would protect James by managing finances responsibly and making realistic care plans. I read it twice, bile rising. They had twisted my devotion into evidence against me. I called David immediately, voice shaking. He didn't flinch. "We expected this," he said. "They're trying to weaponize your exhaustion. Here's how we fight back. You create a care and budget plan. Show exactly how you'll manage James's rehab, finances, and long-term care. Concrete, detailed, professional. That's how we win." So I did. For 2 days, I lived at the desk in James's room, papers spread in neat stacks. I cataloged receipts for every expense, marking which ones insurance covered and which we paid out of pocket. I built time logs showing my daily caregiving schedule, hour by hour, woven around James's therapy sessions and appointments. I got a letter from my boss confirming I could return part-time on a flexible schedule once James stabilized, with access to the company's respite care benefits. I calculated our monthly budget to the dollar, showing exactly how James's disability payments, my salary, and insurance coverage would sustain us without bankruptcy. 30 pages, tabs, charts, scenarios. A plan so thorough it left no cracks to exploit. When David reviewed it, his tone was different. Steadier, more confident. "This is exactly what we needed. It dismantles their financial argument completely." As I slid the binder shut, exhausted but determined, my phone buzzed. It was the insurance case manager. My appeal decision was ready. The case manager's voice was cautious but not unkind. "We're approving a 2-week trial period in acute rehab. If James meets specific criteria during the initial assessment, the authorization can be extended." It wasn't the sweeping victory I'd prayed for, but it was a lifeline. Acute rehab meant therapy, progress, hope, not the silent purgatory of long-term acute care. "Thank you," I said, not once but 5 times, the words tumbling out with relief. When I told James, her eyes lit. Her thumb pressed faintly against my hand, a response so clear it felt like a celebration. The next morning, William returned, this time with a colleague in tow. He explained the design of the session, a blinded test. His colleague knew nothing about James's history, nothing about what we claimed she could do. She was there to observe and record, impartial and sharp-eyed. For over an hour, William ran James through randomized commands. Squeeze once for yes, twice for no. Move your thumb when you hear your name. Hold still when it's a different name. 27 trials in all. James answered 23 correctly, 85% accuracy. I watched as William's colleague documented every response, nodding slowly with each deliberate squeeze, each pause that wasn't random at all. When the test ended, William looked at me with quiet conviction. "I'll have the formal report in 2 days. It will state in no uncertain terms that James demonstrates consistent volitional motor control and cognitive processing." Real evidence, not just my desperate word against John's. That evening, David called. The guardianship hearing was set for the following week. 3 days to prepare. I buried myself in preparation. I organized binders with colored tabs, medical documentation, nursing observations, video recordings, financial planning, witness statements, John's threat timeline. I made copies of everything, slipped them into sheet protectors, triple-checked nothing was missing. I coordinated schedules with the nurses who'd witnessed James's responses, making sure they could appear in court. The visitor logs became a centerpiece, clear proof that James's vitals spiked every single time John entered, then calmed when she left. I built a meticulous timeline of John's behavior, from her first demand for divorce to her whispered threat to pull the plug. The night before the hearing, David came to the hospital. For 3 hours, we sat at a table covered in paper, going line by line through the evidence. He grilled me with practice questions about caregiving routines, my professional qualifications, the budget plan, how I intended to manage long-term care. His tone was relentless but steady, sharpening me into readiness. By midnight, I felt as prepared as humanly possible, but lying on the hospital cot afterward, I barely slept. Every nightmare scenario flickered through my head. At 9 a.m. sharp, the hearing began. The courtroom was small, paneled in dark wood that made the air feel heavier. The benches were hard, the chairs uncomfortable. A bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Susan Dowling entered. We all rose until she seated herself behind the bench. A woman with gray hair drawn into a no-nonsense bun, glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. John sat across from me at the opposing table, her attorney, Joseph, beside her. Bean wore an expensive suit and shuffled his papers with a theatrical efficiency, as though performance might replace substance. David stood and began, calm, deliberate, precise. He presented our evidence first, walking Judge Dowling through the videos of James responding to commands, the nursing notes confirming voluntary movements, Williams' evaluation documenting 85% accuracy, and the detailed timeline of John's threats and harassment. As the evidence spread across the judge's desk, I felt the weight shift in the room. For the first time, it wasn't just my fight. It was fact against lies, proof against manipulation. David's presentation was calm but relentless. He argued that I was not only a competent spouse but also a licensed physical therapist with a professional understanding of James's condition and rehabilitation potential. He laid out the evidence that James was demonstrating cognitive function and voluntary motor control, and he made it clear that John's petition was rooted not in medical reality but in outdated assumptions and personal bias. Judge Dowling leaned forward, eyes sharp behind her glasses. She asked about James's prognosis, about my caregiving plan, about the resources I had lined up for long-term support. My hands shook, but I answered every question as clearly as I could, my voice steadying as I spoke about schedules, therapy sessions, and financial planning. Then it was Joseph's turn. John's attorney painted me as an overwhelmed husband, clinging to false hope, interpreting random reflexes as signs of consciousness. He argued that John's actions were nothing more than a loving attempt to protect both her son and her daughter-in-law from financial devastation and prolonged suffering. His words dripped with practiced sympathy, but to me they sounded like knives hidden behind velvet. The judge listened in silence, flipping through binders, reviewing charts, watching video clips. The room felt frozen until finally she spoke. The evidence, Judge Dowling said, clearly demonstrates that James exhibits cognitive function and voluntary motor control. These are not reflexes, but documented, repeated responses, observed by multiple neutral parties and confirmed through formal testing. Mr. She glanced at me. You have acted as a reasonable advocate for your wife. There is no basis for psychiatric evaluation, and there is no basis for the removal of your authority as her spouse. My knees nearly buckled. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But Judge Dowling wasn't finished. She adjusted her glasses and continued. Furthermore, given the documented pattern of harassment and the direct negative impact on the patient's stability, I am issuing a temporary no-contact order. John will not be permitted to visit James during the acute recovery period. Across the table, Joseph shot to his feet. Your Honor, my client has a right to see her daughter-in-law. The judge cut him off with a raised hand. Patient safety and medical stability take precedence over visitation rights. The order stands until further review. John's face flushed crimson. She leaned into Joseph, whispering furiously, but there was nothing she could do. The judge set a follow-up for 30 days, encouraging mediation before any full guardianship hearing. Then she adjourned. We all stood as she left. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I'd just survived a storm. Relief flooding me, exhaustion weighing me down, and a lingering anger that it had ever gone this far. 3 days later, James was wheeled down to the acute rehab unit. I walked beside her gurney, holding her hand, as her eyes tracked the ceiling tiles overhead. The rehab wing was different. Wider hallways, sunlight spilling through tall windows, artwork on the walls instead of the sterile machinery of ICU. It felt less like a place of endings, more like a place of beginnings. They settled her into a private room facing east, where the morning sun poured in. Within an hour, the rehab team assembled for their first assessment. The speech therapist came in with a laminated communication board, words and phrases arranged in neat rows. She positioned it at eye level. "James, look at yes if you understand the instructions." James's eyes shifted deliberately to the top corner. "Yes." The therapist nodded and began cycling through options. Thirsty, tired, cold. James's gaze moved with purpose each time, locking on the right word. By the end of the session, she had communicated 12 different preferences. Everyone was documented as functional gain in her chart. I stood in the corner, heart swelling, watching as my wife, the woman John had called a vegetable, told the world, word by word, that she was still here. Hope surged through me as I watched James work the communication board, her gaze deliberate, her choices infused with her old stubborn clarity. It wasn't just proof, it was her shining through the woman John had called gone forever. The next morning, David called. "Mediation is this afternoon," he said. "Neutral ground, conference room downtown. Keep your evidence organized, stick to facts, and stay calm, no matter what." I spent 2 hours that morning combing through my binders one last time, sliding in the new speech therapy documentation, printing photos of James's board session. Each page felt like armor. The mediator's office was as sterile as a waiting room. Gray carpet, fluorescent hum, a long table with chairs designed to keep you uncomfortable. The facilitator, a middle-aged woman with the kind of voice that brooked no nonsense, introduced herself and laid out ground rules. Respectful communication, no interruptions, focus on solutions. John sat across from me, Joseph at her side. Her jaw was tight, her hands folded so stiffly they might have snapped. I began. I opened the binders and walked through the timeline. Every visit, every spike in James's vitals, every tear, every threat. Witness statements, dates, nursing notes. The facilitator asked John pointed questions about each incident. Her face reddened as she tried to pass off her behavior as concerned. When I presented the nurses' accounts of James's tears and heart rate soaring during John's visits, the facilitator turned to her directly. "Do you understand that your presence caused measurable harm to the patient?" John opened her mouth, but Joseph laid a hand on her arm and whispered something. She closed her lips, her eyes narrowing. We broke for 15 minutes. I stepped into the hall and called the rehab unit. The nurse's voice was warm. James had rested comfortably that morning and used the board twice more to communicate. Relief softened my chest. When we reconvened, the facilitator asked for outcomes. I stated mine clearly. John must suspend the guardianship petition, and any visits must be supervised only if James consents. John countered with demands for regular updates and the chance to rebuild the relationship when things stabilized. Joseph scribbled proposed terms onto his pad. The mediation dragged on for over 4 hours. Phone calls, whispered consultations, paper sliding back and forth. By early evening, we had a signed agreement. John would suspend her guardianship petition in exchange for structured monthly updates and supervised visits contingent on James's explicit consent. She signed with a stiff, angry flourish, eyes averted. I signed too, relief flooding me but mingled with a bitter edge, that it had taken legal intervention just to protect my wife from my own mother. 2 days later, Mary called with unexpected news. The hospital's education department was scheduling mandatory training for staff on distinguishing reflexive movements from volitional ones. They're using James's case as an example, she explained, so future patients don't get dismissed by cursory evaluations. It hit me like a strange kind of justice. James's fight was already rippling outward, teaching others, changing the system that had nearly abandoned her. That same week, a letter arrived from the peer review committee. They had evaluated Robert Waite's conduct and recommended he complete continuing education on communication capacity and family dynamics in catastrophic injury cases. It wasn't the rebuke I wanted, but it was accountability. Professional acknowledgement that his rushed dismissal had been inadequate. Harmful, even. I read the letter 3 times, letting the validation settle in. By Friday, the insurance case manager called. Authorization extended by 2 additional weeks, she said. James's functional gains were undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt like the ground under us was beginning to hold. The case manager listed James's gains one by one: improved head control, consistent eye-gaze communication, the beginnings of triggering adaptive switches during therapy. Each detail felt like another stone laid in the bridge toward her recovery. If progress continues, we'll extend again, she said. We'll reassess in 2 weeks. I thanked her over and over before hanging up, clutching the phone like it had become part of me. For once, the future didn't feel like a cliff. That weekend, an occupational therapist met me at the house. We walked through each room slowly, tape measure in her hand, notebook in mine. She measured doorways for wheelchair clearance, mapped grab bar placement in the bathroom, sketched plans for a roll-in shower. She stood in our bedroom and pointed out where a hospital bed would fit, how lifts could be installed for safe transfers. I scribbled everything down, my mind spinning with numbers. Savings accounts, a small loan my parents had offered, projected insurance coverage for adaptive equipment. The totals were frightening, but not impossible. For the first time, I felt like I was preparing for James to come home, not just surviving day to day, but building a life we could return to together. On Monday, the speech therapist wheeled in a tablet with an eye-tracking app. James spent an hour practicing, her gaze selecting words and phrases, clumsy at first, then steadier, clearer. By the end, she was forming full sentences. I leaned close and asked softly, "How are you feeling about everything?" Slowly, patiently, the words appeared on the screen. "Proud of you." Then, "We will make it." My throat closed. Tears poured before I could stop them. I pressed my forehead against her hand, squeezing it as she squeezed back, and for several minutes we just sat there in silence, both of us too full to speak. By Wednesday, the mediation agreement was finalized. Signatures from both attorneys, notary stamp, everything binding. The terms were carved in black and white. I retained full decision-making authority. John could only have supervised contact, and only if James explicitly consented through her communication methods. No harassment, no threats, no interference with care. In return, I'd send monthly written updates through our attorneys, keeping John informed without ever giving her direct access again. I filed the agreement with the court, and Judge Dowling's clerk confirmed it was attached to the record. Enforceable, final. It felt like shackles falling away. That same week, I began filling out community grant applications for home modifications and equipment. The forms were long, invasive, demanding every detail of our finances, our needs, our future plans. But within 5 days, a local foundation for families facing catastrophic injuries responded. The coordinator called me herself. "You've been approved for $8,000 in assistance," she said. She walked me through how to use the funds, how to channel them directly toward equipment and contractor payments, how to apply for respite care and caregiver support. I must have thanked her 10 times. My voice cracked with gratitude. Strangers were stepping in where my own family had tried to sabotage me. "This is why we exist," she told me gently, "to make sure no one goes through this alone." 6 weeks after the crash, I walked into my office for the first time. The place smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, unchanged and indifferent. My boss had set up a flexible schedule. Mornings at work while James had her rehab sessions, afternoons and evenings back at the hospital. It wasn't normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. But it was balance. Fragile, imperfect, hard-won balance. And it was enough. When I walked into my office that first morning back, I found a card waiting on my desk, signed by every person in the department. Inside were notes of encouragement, scribbled jokes, promises that they were pulling for me and James. 3 of my coworkers had even donated vacation hours so I wouldn't lose health insurance or take the crushing pay cut I'd been bracing for. For a moment, standing there with that card in my hand, I felt my throat tighten. Not all families abandon you, I thought. Sometimes the family you find is stronger than the family you're born with. At lunch, I called James's rehab facility the same way I would every day after. The therapist told me she was already using her eye tracking device in group sessions, communicating with staff, laughing at inside jokes she spelled out one slow letter at a time. It was strange, balancing spreadsheets at work in the morning, then listening to progress reports about James's recovery at noon. Two lives running in parallel, both mine, both surreal, and somehow both necessary. 2 weeks later, the therapist who had facilitated our earlier mediation reached out again. She scheduled another session with John. I sat in her waiting room on a Thursday afternoon, heart pounding in my chest. John arrived late. She looked older than I remembered, worn down, shadows under her eyes. The therapist started with strict rules. All communication had to go through her office. Every visit required James's explicit consent via the device, and one violation would trigger the reinstatement of the no-contact order. The rules were written in stone this time. Then John did something I never thought I'd see. She apologized. Not a sweeping, emotional plea, just a quiet, tired admission. "I was afraid of losing you," she said. "I handled everything wrong." I nodded, but I didn't say I forgave her, because I didn't know if I could. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The therapist wrote it all down, had us sign, and John left without excuses, without demanding hugs or playing the martyr. Just gone. That weekend, James was approved for her first weekend pass from rehab. We rented a medical transport van and brought her home. The new ramp was ready, grab bars bolted in the bathroom, her communication device mounted beside the couch like it had always belonged there. That evening, we sat together in our living room. The TV murmured in the background. I asked her quietly what she wanted for our future. Her eyes moved across the device's screen, deliberate and slow. One word at a time appeared. "We stay together." I held her hand. "We will," I whispered, "no matter how hard it gets." I was exhausted, I was terrified, but for the first time, I was hopeful too. Because no matter what storms we'd faced or what storms waited, we were moving forward together, and that was everything. So that's the end for now. If you've stayed with me through this, thank you. Sharing it makes carrying it a little lighter. I hope you walk away with some of that weight lifted too.